So we're going to do things a little differently, recognizing that this is a very special episode. Angela, who is just an incredibly brilliant poet and writer and all of the things, has graciously agreed to open and close us with some of her work. So I'm actually going to hand over to her before we get into our main fun part here. So over to you, Angela.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Promise. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you guys today. The first poem I'm going to read is called Hit the Road, Jack. And I wrote this poem after a conversation that I had at a community member's house that was just before a 5-year homecoming that we have in our community that invites all of our folks back home because as the community grew and the elders would die off and the homestead would be too expensive to keep going and we would just lose valuable community members, and they left and they just never came home, creating this vulnerable space in our community. And so I listened, as I always did as a kid and growing up, and I used my gifts to sort of bring language to some of these things that we're seeing in our community. So the first poem I'm going to read to you is called Hit the Road, Jack. Hit the road, Jack. There's no reason to come back. No more, no more, no more. They hate you here. The family's poor. Can't get yourself an education. They don't respect the legislation, so unemployment is your destination. Hit the road, Jack. There's no reason to come back. No more, no more, no more. Your parents are gone now, and the corner store. And as for the homestead, well, the family is still poor. It's gone now. The new codes no one can afford. Hit the road, Jack. There's no reason to come back. No more, no more, no more. Your community is still here fighting what they started fighting for. They still hate you down here. Some are fighting for our rights. We're making progress slowly, but the end is nowhere in sight. A lot of attitudes are still the same. Not much changed since you left, except your family's growing here. There's kinfolk you ain't met. They pushed you to the edges, to the margins and beyond. Called your home a blight, your worth a burden, your dreams they never saw. But now it's time for you to claim the place you had to leave. Take back the parts they pushed away, to heal, to love, to breathe, to reconnect to kinfolk. Oh, it's time for your return, to face the pain you ran from when you left and watched it burn. The elder's wisdom fades away. The youth must rise and grow. They need all of our strength right now. Come back, there's seeds to sow. Your vision, you're the vision, you're the dream, you're the hope to start anew. You're the key that holds tomorrow and the light we still pursue. For our future generations, there is so much left to do. So please hit the road, Jack, and won't you come back to your home? Thank you.
So powerful, so powerful. Thank you so much for that, Angela. Um, I'm going to go ahead and get us started on the rest of today's panel. So, hello everybody, and welcome to today's Prevention Matters panel session. Prevention Matters is a monthly online panel that's hosted by the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, where we dive into what it means to prevent homelessness in our different communities. And I actually wanted to take the time to acknowledge that today is our 10th episode. So thank you so much to all of you for joining us for this really cool milestone. As you can see from just our introduction alone, which has like already blown my mind, we are in for a very special time today. Most of us know that prevention is necessary if we want to solve the current housing crisis. But the series exists because if we want to address homelessness through prevention, then we must be clear on what prevention means. So what can we do to reduce the chances that someone will experience homelessness in the first place? What can be done to support people who are at a high risk of homelessness or who have recently become homeless? And how can we ensure that people who have experienced homelessness and who are now housed don't face housing precarity again? To delve into these questions, Prevention Matters invites brilliant minds to tell us about how prevention looks in their work, along with the lessons they've learned along the way. Today's session, however, is going to explore prevention through a lens that's a little different. And to explain why that's the case, I will take it straight from the person who inspired this episode in the first place. And so I'm going to take us back to what Clovis Grant had to share a little over a year ago when he joined us for the second episode. Here's what Clovis had to say.
Track, just thinking about what prevention is, and really it's looking upstream. I think the sector has focused so much on the downstream intervening and not enough on your question about what can we do upstream. I do want to go back to the structural factors. I think ensuring, and we know there's a lot of conversations around DEI and is it helpful, is it not? We can't stop that work. We cannot stop talking about equity, the legacies of capitalism and racism and enslavement, and what that does to people, what that has done to Indigenous people, what that has done to Black people. And so if that work does not continue within our organizations, doing some of the activities that we do won't necessarily solve the problem. So I want to make sure that we ground our work in understanding the why, because that's going to be so critical. And then in terms of some of the other things that I think we can do is when you understand the why, then you become intentional. You start to think about, okay, if that is the legacy, what does my organization, what can I do in terms of the work we do? And that's the approach I took at 360 Kids, is to say, we've been seeing this data for a while, and we, unlike rest centers, we're not a specific B3 Black focused organization. And so here I am sitting on this data. I have to do something. We have to do something to address what we're seeing. And while it may not be fully upstream, it's a start. And we started collecting data. We started looking at that data.
As you heard from Clovis just right now, it is so important to understand the context that underlies some of the issues we're facing today in order for us to effectively address all the things that we're trying to face. Also, it's very cool to be able to refer to previous episodes and cite them as a reason for the work that we're currently doing. Emma's actually going to go ahead and help me put a link in the chat where you can access the full episode recording for free. And I'd really encourage you to check it out after the session. If you're currently watching this episode back as a recording, then Clovis's episode will be linked somewhere in the description box or somewhere on the webpage. So I still encourage you to check it out over there. As he mentioned, understanding the whys behind homelessness is essential to effectively addressing it today. Jumping to action without understanding the context can otherwise lead our organizations down the wrong path in their prevention efforts, even though they might be well-intended. So, to commemorate Black History Month this year, February's panel is going to unpack often overlooked pieces of history that underlie modern experiences of homelessness for Black communities. And our panelists have some incredibly powerful things to share in that regard. However, before we get into it, I wanted to remind you that these sessions are not your typical webinar. Your participation is a key part of this experience, and so I strongly encourage you to engage among yourselves in the chat and ask any and all questions you might have during our open Q&A in the second half. I also wanted to remind you that your feedback is very important to us. So if you have any thoughts on how we could improve your experience, we'd really appreciate hearing from you. Please take a moment to make use of our feedback form in the chat because we do want to hear from you. The session will be recorded and shared publicly on our YouTube channel. So if you would like to maintain your privacy, I'm going to invite you now to turn off your video and rename yourself using the tools at the bottom of the screen. Since we're gathering online today, a single land acknowledgement doesn't capture the richness of our many locations. The Canadian Observatory on Homelessness is based in York University, Toronto, and so we'll share their land acknowledgement, pardon me. But we invite all of our guests to consider their position regarding the land in which they find themselves. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. In recognition of today's guests, we also recognize that African Nova-Scotians are a distinct peoples whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched the part of Mi'kma'ki, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq peoples that is known as Nova Scotia, for over 400 years. So without further ado, I'm going to be handing over to Dr. Marie-Cécile Kodak, who is one of the brilliant panelists that's going to be joining us later today alongside Angela. Cécile is a professor at the University of Calgary School of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape. She has over 15 years of experience as a social planner in the homelessness sector, and she'll be setting the stage with some context before we get to the fun part of our interview. So to Cécile and all the other wonderful people joining us today, we look forward to hearing from you. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Promise. It's such an honor to be here today. I met Angela and Reverend Dr. Denise in Ottawa. And we were on the same panel, and it was quite inspirational and really moving. So I'm really glad that we have another opportunity to be together on a panel. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. And sorry if you hear me sniffling, that's because I'm overcoming a cold. So just bear with me. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Yeah, okay, perfect. All right, so let me just adjust here. Okay, so as Promise has introduced myself, I am from the University of Calgary. So I'll give a land acknowledgement. The University of Calgary is located on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika and Piikani and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Good Stoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, District 5 and 6. So today I'll be giving you a presentation about Black homelessness in Canada. And just a brief rundown. It's very important for us to contextualize what we're going to be talking about today. So this presentation offers some background information. I'll talk about a brief history of Black Canadians to, again, contextualize our discussion. And then I'll touch on some statistics as well as share stories on the impacts of housing and systemic anti-Black racism. And then I'll conclude the presentation today and then go into the panel discussion. Discrimination against Black Canadians in Canada is deeply entrenched and normalized in Canadian institutions, policies, and practices, and unfortunately is often invisible to those who do not feel its impact. And this form of discrimination really has a very long history, and is uniquely rooted in European colonization in Africa, as well as the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade here in Canada. Almost 2 centuries ago, after the abolishment of enslavement, these racist ideologies that have been established during these periods in history have really continued to drive processes of stigma and discrimination towards Black communities. And today we find that Black Canadians experience housing and social inequities that have been linked to processes of discrimination at multiple levels of society, including individual, interpersonal, institutional, and societal discrimination. And housing policies, our practices, our programs and services continue to be influenced by Eurocentric perspectives and approaches, worsening the marginalization of Black Canadians. And although Black history is quite lengthy here in Canada, it was very important for me to look at our past to understand what is currently happening, the contemporary inequities, as well as how we can resolve these issues that we continue to experience. So I always say, when you're watching a movie, do you start from the end of the movie or do you start from the beginning? You always start from the beginning. So it's important for us to understand, again, the why as to the challenges that we're experiencing as Black communities. So I'll touch on some key pivotal moments throughout the 400 years of Black history here in Canada to really highlight what has been applicable and what has shaped the landscape we're experiencing. So Black history in Canada consists of racial inequities that is deeply rooted in colonial legacies of legalized enslavement, dispossession, racial segregation, and discrimination policies and practices. I always start with this first slide here, which is the first African in Canada, because there's always this misconception that every Black person in Canada is a recent immigrant. However, as I've said, Black Canadians have a 400 plus history here in Canada, and we're witnessing that with our distinguished panelists here today. And so the first Black person to arrive in Canada was Matthew da Costa, and he was a multilingual interpreter who served both the French and Dutch traders. Enslavement was authorized in Canada by King Louis XIV, which provided slave traders the opportunity to enslave thousands of people of African descent as well as indigenous people in both the colonies, in both British and French colonies. And these colonies denied their humanity. They bought and sold them like properties. They exploited them for labor, and they subjected them to all forms of violence, such as physical, sexual, psychological, and reproductive violence. And although the British abolished slavery in Canada in 1834, discriminatory practices and policies continue to exist, really highlighting the failure of emancipation to bring about equality to people of African descent in Canada. Now we'll look at some racial segregation, highlighting some racist and discriminatory policies that have existed. In Canada, Black people have faced segregation, systematic segregation and discrimination in all areas such as education, employment, housing, transportation, immigration, healthcare, and commercial establishments. For instance, universities such as Dalhousie University, McGill University, University of Toronto, and Queen's University all had policies preventing Black students from applying and getting accepted into medical and nursing programs. The last segregated school in Canada closed in 1983 in Nova Scotia, in spite of the Canadian Human Rights Act passing in 1977. However, we continue to see systemic discrimination that has continued to impact Canadians. I also wanted to highlight anti-Black immigration policies because we're seeing that rise again in our current context. So another example of racist policies and practices include the Anti-Black Immigration Act, which barred Black immigrants from entering Canada from 1910 to 1967 because they were deemed as inferior to the climate in Canada. As a planner, it's always very important for me to understand how my sector, my field, my profession has contributed to the displacement and contributed to spatial inequities impacting Black Canadians. Urban planning has historically and systematically contributed to the racial segregation and displacement of Black communities in Canada, leading to inequalities in the housing landscape. We know that planning tools such as zoning bylaws, restrictive covenants, and urban renewal schemes that swept through Canada as well as the US were used for racial discrimination, displacing communities such as Africville and Hogan's Alley, to name a few. Redlining seen in Africville has really perpetuated wealth inequality for generations. Black Canadians have continued to fight for our rights and continue to do so today. The history of Black people in Canada has been marked by ongoing racial inequities that persist in present times through various policies or lack of policies and practices. Looking at the available data, and this is something that came as a shock to me when I started really diving deeper into Black homelessness in Canada, is that there is a lack of research and data collection on the experiences of Black Canadians, not just in the housing sector, but across different sectors. However, the limited data that we have, we found that there is an overrepresentation of Black racial LSGBTQ+ and newcomer youth experiencing homelessness. And this is due to discrimination and racism that has been embedded into our systems and our programs across Canada. In 2021 in Toronto, 78% of youth experiencing homelessness identified as racialized, of which 43% identified as Black. We find that anti-Black racism and discrimination has really fueled disparities in child welfare service, education, employment, healthcare, justice, and housing. For instance, discrimination within the educational institutions has resulted in youths experiencing fewer opportunities to pursue higher education, as well as perpetuates the cycle of poverty. Research shows that Black Canadians are more likely to experience evictions and housing discrimination, live in inadequate housing, and be in core housing need. In 2020, Black Canadians were 3.7 times more likely to experience homelessness in Vancouver. And it's important to note that this last statistics was from the Pitt count. And unfortunately, in Pitt counts, not every municipality has been collecting data for Black communities. So it's hard to tell the length and breadth of the issues that Black communities are experiencing when it comes to homelessness. However, this limited data on the experiences of Black people in Canada really show that for Black Canadians, homelessness is a result of various racially inequitable systems that have been perpetuated by anti-Black racism in policies and in practices. So I would now like to share a video that is a difficult video to watch, especially for me, but it's very important because it is a poignant story from a research contributor that I worked with during my doctoral studies. And his experience, which is sadly not isolated, really illustrates the perspective, the pervasive nature of systemic anti-Black racism and his perspective and his lived experience, as well as its effects on individuals throughout different stages of their lives. And these racist encounters that people encounter at different points in their life and at different systems and sectors can significantly influence their life paths and trajectories. And so this video is also a tribute to the research contributor as he tragically passed away during my research. And so this story is based on actual events and really highlights the life-changing consequences of racism and the dire need for us to address it.
Meet Ikena. Ikena grew up in a two-parent household. At the age of 6, his mother took him off to kindergarten to start his schooling. Ikena was in class with white and Asian children. However, in school, some of the white and Asian children made fun of his skin color, saying things like, "Ew, why is your skin so dark?" Ikena was deeply hurt by these comments, but had no one to turn to for support. The bullying continued, and one day, Ikena defended himself against a kid who called him a black monkey, told him to go back to where he came from, and even shoved him. Ikena punched the kid, and as a result, the teacher suspended him, labeling him as aggressive and violent. Years passed, and Ikena found himself struggling in school. He felt that the teachers were treating white students better than he and his fellow Black students. Even when he asked for help, the teachers were unresponsive, telling him to go do it yourself. Ikena felt like he didn't belong in school, and eventually he dropped out at the young age of 15. As a result of his lack of education, Ikena had difficulty finding meaningful employment and kept running into trouble with the justice system. Ikena stated,
"The policing is really bad. I have been in multiple situations where me and my friends are driving. A cop will be driving in a different direction and see us and turn around, stop us and search us. Call the gang unit. Every time there are like 10 cop cars stopped and searching us. And then they let us go when they don't find anything. On other occasions, they will just stop us and ask our names, even if it's illegal. If we don't give it to them, then they put us in a cell for 24 hours and then let us go."
he felt trapped in the system with a curfew and frequent check-ins from the police, making it impossible for him to work. Eventually, he lost his job and ended up homeless, leading to his arrest and imprisonment. Tragically, Ikena died in jail at the age of 28. Unfortunately, Ikena is an example of the school to prison pipeline. According to Bernard and Smith 2018, The school to prison pipeline has been used to refer to the disciplinary policies and patterns of socialization utilized within school settings to differentially target minority students, particularly African Canadian males, away from educational success and toward incarceration.
Okay, I wanted to just pause for a couple seconds to let us reflect on this. This story is always very difficult to share because it's something that a lot of us relate to on numerous levels, and it's something that impacts us every day. And I know personally I've experienced systemic racism in Canada and housing discrimination. However, because of my support system, I was able to get redirected and not fall into homelessness, but that is not the case for a lot of our community members. And it's very important that we highlight stories like this and we share these lived and living experiences to really understand the depth of systemic anti-Black racism and how this can impact Black Canadians' housing stability. So in summary, this presentation has shed some light on the crucial and widespread issue that requires immediate and sustained action. It has highlighted the systemic barriers faced by Black Canadians across sectors, including their disproportionate representation in various sectors and the socioeconomic disparities that are worsened by anti-Black racism, which we have seen to be a precursor to housing instability and homelessness. Tackling this deep-rooted problem and issue of systemic racism and Black homelessness and housing precarity calls for a holistic approach that includes reforms in systems and policies, increased education, research, and awareness, active community engagement that prioritizes and centers the voices and lived experiences and perspectives of Black communities, reparative housing, investments, policies that center Black-led solutions, as well as culturally appropriate support services and equitable housing options to really alleviate this crisis of housing instability and homelessness faced by Black communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise. Thank you so much, Cecile, for that insightful overview of the challenges that currently being faced today, especially in the Black community. So I'm Salah. I work as a biostatistician at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. And today I will sort of like serve as the host for this conversation. And before we kickstart the panel, I will briefly invite Denise and Angela to introduce themselves to the audience, and then we'll delve into the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Denise Gallard, Reverend Dr. Denise Gallard. I serve as the Vice Chair for Down the Marsh Community Land Trust, which is a startup land trust in rural African Nova Scotia in the town of Truro. I also am a daughter of Nova Scotia. My mother's side, I'm a Jones. Anybody who knows down the marsh, I'm a Jones. I'm part of the Jones clan on my mother's side. My father, who has passed away, was Jamaican. So I'm either the best and the brightest or the worst and the baddest, depending on how you look in the history books. I am Canadian. I was born in Oakville, Ontario, Canada. And so and half of my family now lives out west. So really a truly Indigenous African Canadian experience. And I'm really happy to be here as part of this panel and to have these conversations. Dr. Cecile, I never saw that last image. I don't think it was part of the presentation that we shared with. And it evokes such a deep deep experience, because that idea of broken dreams, broken hearts, no access. I just so appreciate that image, and I have to just keep myself together when I see it. I feel it. Thank you.
All right. And now to Angela, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Angela Bowden. I am a seventh generation African Nova-Scotian. I recently found my great grandfather, who arrived in 1783 on the Apollo in what we know as Birchtown. My family subsequently moved from there to Guysborough County and then to New Glasgow, where I was born and raised. And to put that into context, New Glasgow is the place where Viola Desmond was passing through when they so violently ripped her out of the theater. And I love what Dr. Denise just said about that last slide about Dr. Cecile, because I too had the same sort of visceral feeling, the response in my body. And I almost said wellness check, but then Cecile did that. She gave us a few minutes to just sort of gather ourselves, because I think this conversation is a really deep one, rooted in some really tough subject matter that is historical. And thank you for setting that stage. It was really wonderful. I'm a poet, activist, among many things. You know, as Black women, we're called to do many things. And right now I am the capacity manager with Down the Marsh Community Land Trust. And yeah, so that's me.
Okay, so I was just saying thank you so much for that introduction. And as we saw from the title today, today's panel is going to be focused on the whys and why we see these disparities that Cecil has highlighted in her presentation. And so my question to everyone in the panel today is that what are some key historical factors that have contributed to this homelessness, especially in the Black community today? What would you like to share to the audience from your professional and personal knowledge? What do you think these historical factors that contributed to this homelessness in the Black community? Cecil, you can go first because I have you on top of my screen anyway.
So what are the historical factors?
Yeah.
In my presentation, I highlighted some of them, and it was important for us to recognize that has very, very long roots and started from the 1600s, really. So we're seeing a symptom of a long-standing practice and policy decisions that have systematically marginalized Black communities. And some of the key historical factors have been a lot of it has been discriminatory housing policies and practices, as well as societal norms. And what I saw as a planner was, especially looking at some urban renewal schemes and racial covenants, it was very shocking to see that there were racial covenants that restricted Black Canadians from purchasing property in certain areas, as well as redlining practices in Canada. And a lot of the times we think redlining only happened in the US. However, Africville is an example of redlining, as well as Hogan's Alley is an example of redlining. And we saw through urban renewal schemes the systematic displacement of Black communities. And the destruction of these communities really disrupted generational home ownership. And we know that a lot of the times wealth is built in housing. So displacing Black communities systematically throughout Canada really disrupted that opportunity for generational home ownership and economic stability. And so even if we have those overt policies are no longer there, we still see the symptoms of it, and we still see informal discriminatory practices and policies that exist, as well as even looking at landlords in particular having discriminatory policies, and there are no practices to address this, or no policies or interventions to address this. Another thing I wanted to mention is also employment, because I talked about how Black communities were systematically discriminated against across sectors, not just housing. So it's important that we look at it from a systemic point of view and not just a housing lens. So they were discriminated against in education, prevented from accessing education. They were discriminated against in employment, prevented from accessing meaningful employment, as well as healthcare, as well as transportation, and all those sectors. So all of that combined and overlap, creating this cycle of poverty for Black Canadians. So it's important for us to understand that employment discrimination and economic marginalization have really continued to be perpetuated in Canada today, really keeping us in that cycle of poverty and making us more susceptible to economic shocks and housing instability and precarity.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying, and I want to think about it, maybe zero in on why Down the Marsh Community Land Trust, why we thought this might be a solution to some of the identified barriers that African Nova Scotians have faced for generations. So one of the things that I would put forward is lack of clear land title. You know, you have this piece of land. Where is the title? Who has the title? Did you actually get your title when you purchased or were given, or however the land came into your family? Then there's environmental racism. One of the things, and I mean, as a young person growing up in Ontario and seeing some of the things that were happening in the African Nova Scotian community, is wherever there was a community, they'd like to put the dump there, or some other thing that threatened the health of the environment, even where they lived. And then there's gentrification, because especially with the growth in technology, land that was not desirable becomes desirable. And so it's that purchasing it out or outpricing and gentrification of the area. And then, of course, building on what Dr. Cecile was talking about, there's the ever growing systematic barriers in housing inequity, housing markets and policing, race and gender pressures put on the area. And then there's the lack of housing data. I think that as Canadians across the board, we have been brought up or learned this mentality that, oh no, we don't collect statistics. You couldn't prove what you experienced because there was no data to back you up, especially when we thought of race-based housing. And so that's what I would add to this part of the conversation.
Yeah, and too, I would like to say, just double, I guess, tripling down on what both Dr. Denise and Cecile are saying. It really isn't a new problem. And I think, like the gentleman said on the video that you showed previously, that if we want to understand the problem, we got to go upstream and we got to see where the problem originated in. And Cecile, you set the stage very nicely, as did Promise, with that video. And when we look at when we first arrived here, right? Like, what was the conditions when we arrived here? The land grants that we were promised and we never received. And so we started off from a deficit, and then these problems are still existing in our communities because and I'm just going to talk frank, and because they don't believe we have even the ability to organize around resisting some of these things. They just kind of come in and take what they want from the most vulnerable, and without even thinking about, or I shouldn't even say thinking about, because I think they know full well what they're doing. But we have, I know in our communities here, the African Nova Scotian communities, we're still struggling with environmental racism. We're still struggling with even the response to crisis in our communities, like COVID-19, like Fiona when it happened. We're always the last ones to receive supports around these issues. But it's really difficult to build all of these things like education and a future when your land and your housing vulnerability is constantly at the forefront, right? So we know that in order for us to succeed in any area, we need to take care of that vulnerability, which consistently is being threatened with this urban renewal, which is code for let's destroy them and put up what we want in these spaces, and we'll have very little pushback. But I think what we're seeing is a generation that perhaps is becoming more educated, more aware of the issues, and starting to use some of these tools like the community land trust that Down the Marsh is engaged in, which is its hope is to revitalize the marsh, which was a thriving Black community once upon a time that nobody gave a care about until it became prime land. And now they have all these sorts of remedies for flooding and all these kinds of things, right? So I think the problem is not complex at all. I believe we know what the problem is, and it's historic and contemporary. There's no variation.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing about the history we need to keep in mind. And also like the still ongoing problem that we're still facing. It's important not to underestimate the challenges we are facing because they're big, right? And they're big problems. And recognizing this is important to do what we can in our own small ways to sort of like make a dent, because progress doesn't happen overnight. And with that being said, so one of the things that I was sort of like curious about was like, what has it looked like to sort of address those historical factors, but also like the factors that we are still currently facing, right? What does it look like? And will you sort of like tell us more about the projects that you have going on? And I know like the lease, the land agreements, that the project that you're currently working on in Nova Scotia, but also like in Alberta.
Yeah, well, one of the things I want to say is that I want to be very clear to say that across the country, in Black communities, a community land trust model is being explored in the context of repertory model, like reparations. And one thing that I think across the board we're seeing is this idea of generational wealth. What can we do that will keep and preserve the lands that were ours, and even take back that which has been cheated or stolen or rug pulled under, and use it as a platform to build intergenerational wealth. And community, the model of community land trust, where a nonprofit owns the land. Well, there's different models, but the one we're exploring with Down the Marsh is that the nonprofit would own the land and the homeowners would own the home on the land and be able to pass it on. And there's just so many different ways of doing it, but it is a Black model. It was actually founded in the United States in the South. It was a way of people taking back, preserving, reclaiming. And the community land trust model has been successfully used by people around the world in many cultures. And so this not idea, but a practice of putting back our stakes in the land and finding ways to be able to pass it on and preserve it is highly empowering. But in the midst of it, I think one of our challenges is exhaustion, because when you don't have a foundational undergirding of stability, it's exhausting. And then there's capacity building too, right? Like if I was to talk about it and say, yay, we're doing this thing, it's wonderful, it's easy, it's not true at all. The one of the biggest challenges that I think we face is building capacity in an Afrocentric model, an Afrocentric model in our community, when we've been so disenfranchised, we don't even speak the same languages, and some people are just exhausted. And I think it does really do us well to be doing this in the African Nova Scotian community, which is Canada's Indigenous Black community, because our story really started there and continues there. I mean, even now, as Angela, I don't know if she's going to touch base on it, but in the community, there's some things that happen that you're like, oh my gosh, it's 2025. Aren't we over this? And we're just not. We're still going through those things that my great, 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 great grandfather went through down home, as we would call it.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. And I think like that will get us, take us later in the next question that we have, because it will be really interesting to sort of like hear about the barriers and then the challenges that you're currently facing. And Angela, you can please go next.
Yeah, I think what I really like about the work that we're doing in Down the Marsh, with Down the Marsh in our communities, is that reparative piece that acknowledges that this community existed. It exists, right? And so I think it's really important work, because it's not something that we're doing for the right now. It's something that we're doing perpetuity. Like, so this is like forever. It's not something that's going to fizzle out. I think the work is really challenging, but it's rewarding work. And I just really, when we look at the land vulnerability historically with African Nova Scotians, then the first place for us to start is restoring that land, right? And there's nothing we can do without land, right? And so, and we would like to go back and start there, because that's the beginning, really, is establishing that wealth, so that the goal is to provide that generational wealth for our communities and our lineage for life, so I think the work is really important, because we're setting the stage for, hopefully, the future generations don't have to come back and have this same fight.
Mm.
Thank you.
And I mean, if I may just share our vision and mission, which it took us work to even get there. Like, what is it that we are really envisioning? And we were able to say housing and community assets that build wellness, wealth, and wholeness for African Nova Scotians. That vision, that's our North Star. And how we're going to do it, our mission is to create thriving African Nova Scotian communities by developing collectively owned land assets. So there's a clarity to, what we're aiming for and how we envision and want to work towards that happening. And at the base of it all is reparations and building on our skill sets and taking back our land so that we can thrive.
Oh, yeah, thanks. So one of the things I just wanted to ask was, can you please elaborate on what wellness, wealth, and like wholeness looks like? What does that look like for the Black community in particular?
Well, Angela,
Can you repeat that? What does wellness and wholeness look like?
Like wellness, wealth, and wholeness. What does it look like?
We were just talking about this today, weren't we? Like,
yeah, it looks like collective wellness, collective wholeness. It looks like taking care of community. Like it looks like prayer. It looks like spirituality. It looks like safety. Oh my goodness, like we are living literally, our central nervous system is on high alert all the time in these environments, especially in light of the Trump regime, right? I'm just going to say it because it is what it is, Trump has made every bad thing that could ever possibly exist in a person come to the forefront. And we're seeing this in our communities. And so our ability to just gather collectively and share, like Dr. Denise was saying, like how we're looking at building an Afrocentric model, but we all don't even speak the same language, right? Like and I don't mean language as in language, I mean as in, what what wholeness and wellness looks like. So what wholeness and wellness looks like to me may not be what wholeness and wellness looks like to you, but at its very core, at its very root, it looks like safety. It looks like peace. It looks like loving your neighbor. It looks like looking out for each other and having a collective vision that is rooted in the collective struggle. And I think we did this really well in the past, and I think we can do this very well again in the future. Yeah, does that answer your question?
I'm going to say moving beyond survival to thriving.
Yes, yes, yes.
Um,
That's
this idea of stability,
Mhm.
where let's just take housing. When someone has adequate housing so that they're not worried about making their mortgage or their rent, so that their door locks, so that there's enough space, so that it's clean, and the air in it is good, it's a foundation on which a person can just thrive.
Mhm.
It's the same as having healthy food. I'm very proud. One of my daughters works in food security. Healthy, clean, available food. These are basic human needs that in Canada, of all places, I believe everyone has a right to. And Canadians as a whole have not interrogated the reasons why people don't have housing stability. You shouldn't have to worry about land being pulled out from you or about some corporation who decides to set up. I mean, there are some very basic things that have happened in Nova Scotia that people don't talk about publicly. Like when we're trying to serve other communities from overseas, because there's a war, you want to give them lands that are Black, promised or owned, or come on. There's all kinds of it. We are always the community that's under attack for basic stability rights. And to raise up a community, a generation who says, no, we're not going to let that happen to us anymore. And not only that, we are going to develop our own models that work. And then whenever something works well for us, it works well for everyone in Canada. That's my argument when it comes to anti-Black racism and all of those things. If that is eliminated for us, then everybody's better off. If we focus on housing stability, then everybody's housing is more stability. Stable, sorry. Anyways, I'll stop.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, these are very, very important conversations because when you talk about generations and when you talk about what work we're doing, it's very important for us we talk about upstream, right? It's very important for us to look at those issues that are upstream. And for me in academia, it's not an institution that I always planned on going into. I came from practice. I love being in practice, but I recognized the need to be in academia because when I was in planning school, I never learned about Black communities. I never learned about urban renewal schemes and how that was used to displace Black communities and the generational consequences of that. And so doing my research and my doctorate, it was a time for me to dig deeper into Black history here in Canada, because it's not something that is being taught in schools at all. People don't know that there is Black history in Canada. So for us as Black professors in these schools, and also for us as teachers, it's very important for us to start educating this generation and equipping them with the tools that we need to dismantle these systems of oppression. So in my case, we're looking at establishing a design justice lab and clinic, which is something that we haven't really done. And we recognize that planning, architecture, landscape, the built environment profession has been instrumental in displacing Black communities. And it is from that recognition and that acknowledgement that we are committed to changing things and planning and practicing through a different lens, through that design justice lens, where we're recognizing the systemic inequities, we're recognizing the history, we are centering and bringing these marginalized communities, racialized communities to the forefront, and talking about these issues, having our communities lead the conversation, lead the solutions, craft these the solutions for our communities because we understand it better. And so it's really centering on Black communities, other racialized communities to work together with other stakeholders to come up with solutions, but really understanding and acknowledging that homelessness for us looks different because of those historical inequities that were established and those practices. And we really have to know our history and know how planning has been used as a tool to displace Black communities and be more intentional in how we dismantle these systems of oppression.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really inspiring hearing about some of the work you all are doing, are currently doing to address these difficulties. And also, like, just to echo what Cecily just said, and there is a need to have Black researchers in the forefront, right? But also, like, on a related note, it's important to acknowledge that there are research and practice barriers faced by Black folks in this sector, trying to support like their communities today. So I imagine you all have something to share here, or as you know, some of the people, our audience members that are joining us today. What are some of the challenges that you face, or actually you're currently facing still now, right? Or you observe over the years that that sort of like hinders you to sort of like do your work either in research, practice, advocacy, or anything? Dennis?
Sorry?
Yeah.
Would say funding.
Okay, good.
Funding is the biggest issue. And when I started my career, I worked with Indigenous people on and off reserve. And I remember this was before we as a nation started recognizing Indigenous homelessness. And because our practice was using a one-size-fits-all model, a colonial approach to addressing homelessness for every community. And Indigenous people were mobilizing to talk about how it's different for Indigenous communities. There's that historical context. And I remember an elder said, you know, there's a lot of commitments being made and conversations about how, yes, we're going to commit to addressing Indigenous homelessness and Indigenous housing challenges. However, the elder said, show me your priorities by showing me your funds and your resources allocated to it. And I thought, that stayed with me till today, really. Because it shows us that it doesn't matter what commitments the governments make and things like that. If there's no resources and funding attached to it, how are we supposed to address these issues? And another thing that I experience is just the lack of acknowledgement of the existence of Black communities and Black people, which has led to the lack of research, lack of data collection, lack of policy interventions, lack of even models that are more targeted towards us. And so the biggest issues are funding, as well as this race-neutral approach to housing policies and dealing with the issues, and really neglecting the fact that there is a long-standing history here. And we need to address things through an Afrocentric model and ways of doing things.
I really appreciate that. I think funding, you've encapsulated it. The other thing I want to talk about is capacity building. Even in the way that nonprofits are set up, there's a system, and it's almost, as someone who works with startup or rebuilding Black nonprofits, there's a capacity gap in which it's almost like the systematic structures are unknown to us. It's almost like you have to unlock the code to understand, to navigate, to get the paperwork in, to set up the structures. At the same time, you need to work in an Afrocentric model, which is totally opposite to those pieces. And it can be quite exhausting for visionary people. Like, you just got to do some things. You've got to submit this paperwork. You've got to have 3 board members. Your board members got to know what to do. You know, it can be exhausting. And so I think a going forward solution to that is a collective of people who will look at Black practices. And today I asked somebody, what do you believe are the election issues that Black Canadians should care about or should be asking? Not to try to give people the answers, because we all have to make our decisions, but what are some of the questions we should be asking? You know, who's talking about that? So we who are passionate about Black homelessness, we've got to come together and ask ourselves some questions, and that can help us build capacity in our communities and find new ways of sharing. And that's always difficult, because there is at times a mentality that we struggle with, that we're just trying to survive. No more surviving. We've got to thrive. I cancel surviving.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, not very much more to say on that question. Funding is, I was going to say funding and attitudes, like, well, capacity building, yeah, but attitudes really, like, but that's really going to lead into the next question for me, because it's really difficult to have all of this vision and all of these ideas, and then be rooted in an environment that just others you and just doesn't see you as a person to begin with, right? And just doesn't value you or your story or your struggle or any of that. And so how much importance, like, I just picked up a book here from an elder that had passed. I got a bunch of her books, and they were talking about the Negro problem in education in the 60s, right? And it's the way in which we've always been viewed and looked at as something that wasn't a part of, right? But there's just something on the fray. And so I think being a part of the actual budgeting considerations, being a part of the actual renewal considerations, like we don't have the consultation that's required when they're coming into our communities to do things, and they're not doing we're not having the appropriate conversations, we're not having the consultations, we're not understanding. There's so much, it's like everything all at once is being thrown at our communities in this time. And then we're here as a nonprofit trying to fix this huge problem, right? That's way bigger than any of us. And so I think, I'm sorry, I just got completely off topic there. I was in my head there for a second, but yeah, I think funding, capacity building, and attitudes. I'll just sum it up.
Yeah, thank you. No worries. That's really good. I think, Cecil, you sort of like mentioned early on, like, about these race neutral approaches, right? For the sake of the audience, can you just elaborate about that a bit? Because, oftentimes, as someone that works in this as a researcher as well, some of these interventions, are sort of like presented as a very race neutral approach, but oftentimes they don't account for the differences in these different communities. We've got different ways. So obviously, if you're bringing in interventions, I think there will be issues with the race neutral approaches. Can you just collaborate about that a bit?
Yeah, it's interesting because when you hear about some of the commitments, especially from the government, where usually everyone that's non-white, non-Indigenous is usually grouped into racialized. And we're seen as monolithic, we're seen as homogeneous, we're seen as one, without recognizing the differences, as well as our historical experiences in Canada and the policies that have impacted us as a group individually as well. So when you look at Canada's way of approaching solving homelessness, I would say it still centers on that race-neutral approach where you have government and industry stakeholders that still operate under this assumption that broad affordability measures will trickle down equitably without recognizing how historical as well as systemic contemporary anti-Black racism continues to create and shape our unique experiences when it comes to housing and instability. So unfortunately, you see that too in the lack of data collection. That
Yes.
is a huge example. Even if the federal government has a requirement for municipalities to collect demographic information based on race and to show that they're collecting information on Black communities. Not all municipalities do that, actually. It started, I think Toronto might have been the first in 2018. And so not Calgary hasn't done it or reported on it. So that is a race neutral approach, recognizing or completely negating the fact that we are not monolithic. We need our own interventions and we have our own unique struggles because of when they talk about specificity, because of the color of our skin. There's something about the color of our skin that incites such hate in some people, and we see that in the States. We see that happening here. You see people holding signs saying deport them all and white lives matter. So what does that insinuate, right? That people like us don't belong here. So we have those unique challenges that we're experiencing that continues to keep us in this cycle of challenges and cycle of poverty. And so if we continue to use these colorblind approaches or race neutral policies, we will not be solving the issues. We need to really recognize that racism exists in Canada, and we need race conscious policies, interventions, approaches, and practices to be able to resolve this issue that we're experiencing as a community, as a nation.
And I don't want us to get discouraged or live in our exhaustion, which is real and needs to be validated. It's Canada. And and the reason I say it's Canada like that, it only takes a few people to make a little noise to make change in Canada, like just historically. And so if Toronto, for instance, is collecting data, Black people in Calgary, where they're not collecting data, just simply need to go and say, hey, why aren't we collecting data? Like just a team of people who will chip away at certain things. And that's what I believe that the community land trusts can also do. We just need to successfully test models that work for us. And if it doesn't work perfectly, we just have to be willing to, okay, that didn't work, but we got something here, let's go. And you keep building one stone upon another. If we look at the fact that we are here, one of my favorite t-shirts that I have is from down home in Nova Scotia. We've been here. I just love it. It has all the communities written on the back. Every time I wear that t-shirt, no matter where I go, there's conversations. Like it really just takes a few of us to say, okay, I'm going to take this piece on. I'm going to take that piece on. And to be hope-filled, you get nowhere with negativity and despair. And it's a good fight. Let's fight the good fight. And I think even, I'm so thankful for this opportunity for us to come together and have a conversation. But it's not just a conversation. Every single person who attended this gathering, whether it's for a few moments or the whole thing, now has a responsibility to do something. And that's what I say to the many young people in my life. Just do something. Pick something. You can't be bored. So when it comes to housing, do something. And things will change.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And yeah, do you have anything to add about that? Or you can just proceed to the next
No,
question.
we'll move along.
Oh, okay, cool. Thank you so much. Well, like you just said, there is some sort of like perhaps an obligation after this conversation for people attending, on what to do next. And because they are intended allies for joining us today, and that what to help, but they need some guidance, about the best practices for things that are working in our communities. and how to support them. So let's talk about some of those advices you might have, like to share before getting to these questions. The first part is like, what does doing the homework look like for an ally, for someone that wants to support? What does like doing the homework look like? And what's the first step? What do you need to start with?
I think the first step would be listening, actively listening to and amplifying the voices of those that are speaking out, supporting them, whether it's your activists, your organizations, taking the time to understand the problem, and not like hearing the problem and just dismissing the problem, or just really taking the time to understand what is all of this about, like what is the land grants about, what is the homelessness about, what is this anti-Black racism that is shaping every facet of these folks' lives, what are they screaming about, right? Like, listen, instead of believing maybe it's not about you or I can't do something about, listen, and then ask questions, research, support financially, speak to your mom, your dad, your business, like just continue to listen, support, and educate yourself and others, pass it on. I think we're in this together. And it reminds me of the Dr. Seuss book, this mess is too big and too long and too wide. And so we need all hands on deck, right? That's the simple answer.
Thank you.
Yes. That sums it. I was gonna say as well, support, educate. I know it's when you talk about allies, I would say when I was going through my doctoral studies, it was very difficult for me because talking about systemic anti-Black racism in the built environment is something that hit pretty close to home and was very personal. But I was able to really lean on my committee members, and one of them is John Rook from Simon House Recovery Center in Calgary, and he is a true ally that helped me really look at how we need to educate ourselves, right? We need to learn about the history here. And working together with my committee, we were able to learn from each other, even if they're not part of the community. But we're able to learn from each other. They listened, they also supported when I needed support when it was very difficult. And so it's not just, we're talking about also financial support, we're talking about using your platform, we're talking about using your position, but we're also talking about mental support, mental health support, being there to talk about the challenges, being there to uplift us because it is difficult work and we need each other, but also making space for us. That's very important. It's not just putting us at the table, but like Angela said, listening, actively listening, hearing us, implementing those recommendations, and really practicing that, not just having us at the table, but not hearing our voices. So it's making space for us, creating space, paving the way, helping to break down those barriers in our path, because we all have a role to play in this and we can't do it by ourselves. We always say if it works for one person, if it works for us, then it's also a benefit for everyone because we all live on this planet. So we all live on this planet together. So instead of being separated, we will live a happier, much happier life working together and being there for each other.
I think when it comes to allies, I always want to say, be prepared to be stretched and to give ground. One of the models of working with allies is advisory committees or panels or whatever. And sure enough, somewhere along the road in development, there comes conflict because allies who come from different cultures want to be the boss. They want to tell you what to do and how to do. And it's almost like they can't help it in the beginning. My joy has always been in building and finding allies who are willing to release their own power for their own growth and lend their expertise. And I think that if you're going to be an ally, one of the first things you have to be able to do is confront the anti-Black racism that lives within you. Because we were all taught certain things. We all grew up and there's things we don't know, and it can hurt. And it can be a shock to you as a person too. And the same way I at times can experience my own feelings of I'm not good enough, or I haven't done the constant barrage of inner criticism or outer criticism that I too have always have to battle, right? So true allies are willing to experience the pain of growth, to walk side by side as an equal partner. And so they need to be prepared to do that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think that sort of like brings us to the next part of the question, which is like, what does working with the Black community look like in your opinion? And what advice do you have for folks trying to collaborate with Black folks organizations? And if you have any resources, organization that you would want to connect them with, what are those?
Well, I can talk right away since it kind of builds off of Cecil Foster, a Canadian author, once said that a black magic marker is drawn through all Black people, not only for people to say we're the same, but then to erase us. So one of the first things that everybody has to know is that we have a lot of diversity. And one of my great joys is meeting my people that come from many different places who are Canadian and learning about their life and experiences. And it's just enriching. So, one of the first things we have to do is erase that Black line. We have to erase it. And we have to make space for our differences, our diversity, and learn from each other and build and grow. So that's one thing that I would say right away. I hope that answers or gets to the answer in the question that you've asked.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Cecil and Angela, do you have anything to add to that?
Sorry. Yeah. Angela, you want to go first?
I would echo what Dr. Denise said, getting comfortable with the uncomfortable too, right? Like it may be something that's really outside of your norm, because you may have I write a lot in poetry, right? Because I'm a poet. And so I like to tackle these. It's easier to tackle some of these big topics in poetry because it's a little less threatening to folks, right? And I understand that sometimes you can feel like, if as an ally, you can feel like you're always being attacked. Well, that may be because some of the things that you believe and you followed are something you need to deconstruct. It might be something that you need to, so it's okay. And you need to know that you're going to get it wrong 1,000 times. And then on that 1,001 time, you're going to get it right. It's not going to be easy. It's not an easy journey to walk with your Black and brown brothers and sisters, but our journey is twice as hard. And so when we can walk alongside with allies that aren't afraid to get it wrong, aren't afraid to be uncomfortable, and I think if you start there, I remember this comment one time, just start at, I'm going to get this wrong before I get it right, and that and listen. I can't express enough the piece of listening to people's stories, listening to their truth, validating that, and not questioning the experts in that matter. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's I second what Dr. Denise and Angela are saying. And when you ask about resources, I've always thought about, well, for us, we know what to do, how to do it, how to approach it. However, taking a perspective of someone that doesn't belong to our community led me to work with folks in the shelter system, Black folks in the shelter system experiencing homelessness, as well as key leaders across Canada who are Black that are challenging systemic anti-Black racism in their sectors, to really create a framework, understanding that it's a living document, it's fluid, it's adaptable, but a framework to help allies, policymakers, decision makers, practitioners, and it's called the Black Housing Equity Framework. And it encompasses what's been already shared. And so it looks at different guiding principles that are aligned with our values and our principles as Black communities. It also looks at different ways of co-designing, co-implementing, and co-evaluating. Because a lot of the times, as practitioners, we think, and even in schools, right, we think that we know it all because we have these credentials. However, no, we don't. The community knows it all. It's the community. The people are the lived experts. So they have to be centered in every process from the beginning to the end, and then the evaluation, implementation, and all around. It's a whole process and not just engaging them at the end. So for allies, it's important for us to understand that how we approach things is as a community. And when we're looking at different housing models, when we're looking at addressing housing and homelessness, it has to be centered in our values. And it has to be centered at the core in who we are as people. So it's important for us to be able to have these resources, but to be able to do the work. We have to be willing to do the work, and we have to challenge ourselves in order for us to grow.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think that sort of like brings us to the end of this conversation. And I will read some of the questions that we have from the audience. And feel free to sort of like trap in, anyone can respond. So one of the questions that we have from the audience is like, it says, so inspiring to hear from you all. How have you been coping with the mounting pressures in the world and not slipping into despair? And what has been helping you to keep your chin up, sort of like continue to fight on? And so many of us in the community are struggling with feeling discouraged.
Wow, it's a powerful question.
That is a very deep question.
On a personal note, for me, it's my faith. And I think people take that for granted. Some people will say faith, spirituality, but we are more than our bodies. We are more than our minds. We are more than what's happening to us and around us, and for that. And so for me, my faith keeps me hopeful, keeps me active, keeps me grounded, and gives me strength. And I make no apology for that. I have no apologies. I also love to dialogue about how my faith has been used to harm my own people. It's harm and help, right? There's that two sides of, I'm a Christian, so there's that narrative, that story, and that real damaging thing that's happened. But then there's also the freedom, the hope. So I love that. I embrace that. I embrace it all. The messy wonderfulness of it keeps me strong. And then been giving of myself to community initiatives. And even if I think of the congregation, and if I think of my work, I think of my coaching, I prioritize my community without apology. I love all people. I just love people. I do. I love people. I love meeting people and working with people, but I prioritize my community without apology. So whatever I work at, whatever I lend my skills to, I prioritize. I don't prioritize money. I don't prioritize my own, well-being, although it's important. I prioritize my community. And in prioritizing my community, I make demands on my community and on myself. Like, I'm not trying to die. I'm not trying to not have space for quiet and rest and health, and that is because I prioritize my community. I'm not trying to be everybody's role model, but I can't tell Dr. Cecile to take care of herself, or Angela to take care of herself, or you to take care of yourself if I'm not going to take care of myself. So because I prioritize my community, I make decisions based on that. And I refuse to be pulled down into the abyss of negativity. That might mean working on language. So instead of stakeholders, I use collaborators. Oh, it might not be a big deal to you, but it speaks to me. It calls me to a higher ground. A colleague of mine who's a university professor sent me a declaration yesterday. From now on, she has banned the word cherry picking in amongst her students, and she talked about that. I said, amen. I took that up. So anything that gives life, I grasp hold of, and that's how I manage. Sound like a preacher, eh? I'll stop talking to you.
Now, spoken like a true preacher. You just took us to preach, Dr. Denise.
It is who
Thank you.
Sister Ruth, a poet, said, I am what I am. I'll do what I can to
Yeah.
destroy their plan.
Absolutely. And I think that it's so true. Like finding your tribe, connecting with people who breathe life into you, not being afraid when you're speaking to that person, say, hey, you know what? I'm not feeling the best today. Hey, you know what? Can you pray for me today? Like I know when I'm talking to Dr. Denise, I'll often say, like, can you pray over me today? You know, and she may not know, or I may have shared with her, I may not have shared with her what's going on in my life, but I know she's a sister that can pray for me. And I know she's someone who generally will lift me up. Also, it's understanding that I'm not here to do it all, right? Like greater people than me have existed in this world and none of them have fixed the problem, right? So my job is not to fix the problem. My job is to run my leg of the race, pass that baton and get out of here, right? Like, and I think sometimes I know it took me a long time to recognize that because I'm so passionate about community and because I have these gifts as a writer and a poet, like I feel like such a burden, like this righteous burden to deconstruct language and to use my gift to then relay that back to folks. But I am not the person who's going to fix this, right? I am one grain of sand on that beach, and I'm going to do what I'm here to do. And then there's tons of us, right? So releasing yourself of that burden that you have to fix the problem. The problem was here before us, it'll be here after us. And our job is to run our leg of the race and connect with our brothers and sisters and check in on each other, and just be a support to each other, be a support to yourself. Like Dr. Denise said, you can't pour from an empty cup. So you need to really give to self first, and you really need to do things that recenter you, like quiet it, especially right now in today's times. We need to quiet that outside and go back inside, just sit with yourself, just allow yourself to lead, allow God to lead, but sit with yourself in silence sometimes and just meditate on him. I'm a believer too. So that's a huge part of my direction is spirituality. And then checking in on folks. And like, just a simple, how are you doing? Yeah. And something else I find we as Black folks suck at sometimes is seeking help, asking for help, admitting that we need someone to pray over you. You need someone to talk to. And that's my 2 cents.
That's very important because I really love that question, because a lot of the times, because we're in these spaces, we always want to prove that we deserve to be here. We're hardworking, we're qualified, we go beyond, above and beyond every single time. And it impacts our mental health. It impacts our physical health. It impacts our relationships. It impacts every aspect of our life without us even knowing, because we really want to fight that fight and we know the value of it. And I'm learning, and this is something that I'm learning later on in my life, but I'm learning especially from my doctoral supervisor. She said, you're a mother. You're a person first, and then you're a mother.
Yeah.
Don't forget that. And I had to sit with that, because a lot of the times you say yes to everything. You want to do it, you're committed, and then you're drowning. Your mental health is suffering, your physical health is suffering, your relationships are suffering. And you don't want to admit it because you want to prove that you belong here. But I'm learning that, what's important to me, number one, my faith. It has gotten me through every difficulty in my life. And also my family. I'm raising 2 wonderful boys that will be the next generation and will be change drivers. And it's important for me to emulate that and show them how to balance their life. And a husband that's very supportive, but it's also recognizing that I have to be there for them and be there for myself. And I have to make that space intentionally. So it's important for us to really be unapologetic about saying, you know what, I am centering my mental health and my physical health today.
Mhm.
And that's hard for us as Black women, as Black people. But we have to start that movement. We have to start centering ourselves because no one else is going to do it but us.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that brings us to the next question, which is pretty much specific to academia. So I'll throw that to Phil first. One of the participants said, thank you for your presentation. Do you have any advice for scholars, like Black scholars, especially PhD students who are navigating this colonial academic system? It's a very interesting question too, because I've been through it anyway. So do you have any advices for them?
That's a great question
Yeah.
because I know it's hard going through the system here. I never had someone that looked like me in school. I never had anyone that looked like me, not even, and even in the workforce, you're usually the only person or just two of you. So I would say my advice is, like Angela and Dr. Denise have said, find your tribe.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, this is unpopular, but something that I have learned is not all skin folk is skin folk.
Mhm.
And that's a very unpopular thing to say. However, it is true. And we have to recognize, I think for us in academia, and for me, because of my role, I have to recognize the role that I play. And I have to recognize my obligation to support Black students, racialized students, every student, but understanding that there are specific difficulties that Black students experience. And so find your tribe, find people that are willing to mentor you. I've been lucky to find my tribe in academia. I've been lucky to find a network of Black scholars and also allies that are very much supportive and there for me. So understand that they're allies as well, and to find them, to seek them out, and to really form that network around you. And of course, I'm always here if anyone wants to reach out to me.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that question is really interesting because someone that went to school here too, and I was in a department that I was the only Black student in that department. Especially this happens a lot in STEM. And one of the conversations that I had in the Black student association at school was that um, there's a tendency to sort of like put yourself as the representative of the whole race when you're in this situation, and that itself is a problem because it then end up adding more weights on your shoulder. So I think one of the things that can help you navigate these systems that you are there because you're watched to be there, and then you just gotta do what you gotta do, and then just head out because you're not there to represent the entire race, and it's the systems that are so wrong that they didn't give everyone like you the opportunity to be there. So just get in, do your stuff, head out to your community if you can't find anyone around that surrounding. So I think that helped me a lot, just making sure that I'm here to to get educated like anyone else, and I'm not here to represent the entire Black race.
I would also say don't get caught in your own academic ghetto. So read other things. Read other things. Look at some international data. Find an author that moves you. Don't forget things like the archives and articles. One of the things, actually, Dr. Lynn Jones, who's the founder of Down the Marsh, when she was young, she kept every newspaper article about Black life in Nova Scotia, and she has a whole archive thing at one of the universities. Is it Dal, Angela? A very bad niece. I should know it off by heart, but it came to me that don't forget there's other sources of information and nurture out there. Have international conversations because there are profound things that are happening outside of Canada's academia, so don't get yourself just stuck in one subject or one thought inquiry. Literature can lend itself to planning, can lend itself to STEM, can lend itself to, so your tribe isn't only people you can connect with, it's also outside of that. Sometimes one of the things that I had to do is I found authors sometimes and I would just read, 4 things in a row that had nothing to do with what I was studying that kept my mind and my heart and my spirit open and fresh. So that's something I would recommend as well.
I want to quickly just piggyback off of what Dr. Denise said because it just sparked something in me. When I was going through graduate studies in 2020, and I was feeling much the same as the only one. And actually, I was having a really physical response to some of the material and some of the ways in which academia operates. And it's hard to find your tribe as an individual person. But a lot of my tribe members became authors and companions, and they're behind me actually. They're actually like Dr. Carrie Bass. She's when I read that Lonesome Road, I felt seen for the first time in my life. I felt seen, and I think it's important for us to feel seen and feel validated. But you're right; it's not always going to be a person. It could be one of the authors. When I read Christina Sharp, I feel seen. When I read Sadia Hartman, I feel seen. Right? Like when she talks about this living in the afterlives of slavery and in the wakeness of blackness and being, it makes you feel like, oh my goodness, yes, this it is. So to understand that we're not the first to ever be here in these situations having these problems, and we're not the last, but finding those connections in non-conventional ways. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then, yeah, I understand that these are very difficult times, and it's also okay to feel discouraged, right? So let's conclude by inspiring some hope for everyone. So what has success look like in your work so far? So in perhaps one sentence, because I know comms is bugging me. We should wrap up now. Do you have a win or any key wins that you would like to share? Yeah, Cecily, you can go first if you want. Yeah, sure.
I would say raising awareness, being able to hear students, the light bulb go on in their heads and say, whoa, I didn't even know about this. And I am committed to using different tools like design justice and tools that apply to communities to really enact transformative change. I think that's a win for me, is even bringing this conversation to academic institutions, because we're going to be having a Black History Month exhibition opening tomorrow, where we're looking at the 400-year history of Black Canadians. And that's the first time we've done that, bringing that to our School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape. So to me, that's a win, is being able to have these conversations with the next generation of built environment professionals.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You can go on, Angela or Dr. Denise.
What was the question?
So, like, do you have any key successes that you want to share with the audience? At least sort of like in your work right now? And what does like success look like for you?
Well, I think we're really unique in the sense that we have the land to start our project on. I think the fact that we're in it, that we're in this movement, this project, this building of land wealth, and building this organization, and starting the process of educating folks and connecting with collaborators and seeing progress moving forward. I think that in itself speaks to the success of the organization. Like, we started such a deficit to begin with when in our communities. And so I think the mere fact that Down the Marsh even exists is to be commended. Yeah. A key success. Well, there's many of them. I'm drawing a blank. Dr. Denise, you're on.
Well, I mean, I might have a different perspective. I love what both of you have said. And right now, to be transparent, I'm not feeling extremely successful, which is a good thing for me. Because for me, success is always about breaking through barriers. So, right now I'm serving several Black grassroots organizations who are all struggling. And I can see the connected struggle. Maybe a year from now, a week from now, a day from now, they'll have the breakthrough that they're going for. And so success for me looks like breaking through barriers. But as soon as you break through a barrier, there's another one. So it's ongoing work. I really appreciate the question because I've been struggling. Like, what does success look like for me? And so success looks for me like lives changed, people. So I have to look behind me, and I mean I've been at different kinds of community work for years, and there is a trail of young adults and young people, and what I do to keep myself healthy is I meet with them, like we'll go to lunch or dinner or call, so that I can remember that, we have had some success, but the success is not in me, it's in their lives. So breakthrough is success, and I would just say that breaking through barriers is slow, painful work, but once it's broken through and on one level, there's a permanency to that, so you get to go to the next one. I don't know if that's helpful. I might run kicking and screaming from that kind of definition, but it's just my truth.
It's honest.
Yeah, I mean, that's honest. I mean, I thank you, everyone. Thank you all for this wonderful conversation. But also, like, I wish you all the best with all of this initiative. Hopefully, next time we meet Dr. Dennis, there will be a lot of, breakthroughs that we can, sort of like discuss about. So I will hand over to Promise to sort of wrap this up. But again, thank you so much for this wonderful, insightful conversation. And happy Black History Month to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much to Sala, and thank you so, so much to all of our panelists for all of the incredibly inspiring things that you've shared today. It has been a truly inspirational time, and just, yeah, I mean, you can see it in the chat and you can see it on the faces of those of us who are still in the audience today. I think you've just inspired a lot of hope for a lot of people during a time where it feels like more of a scarce resource, right? And so we really thank you for sharing all of that. I'm just going to wrap us up with a couple of quick closing announcements, and then we'll go back to handing over to Denise to finalize everything today. Apologies, seem to have lost my slide. Okay, here we go. So, thank you so much, everybody who joined today's panel conversation, especially those of you who are staying right until the end. We have heard some truly inspiring and wonderful things today, and I encourage you to thank all of our panelists in the chat and using your reaction emojis alongside me, just in recognition of them taking the time out of their schedules to come and join us. If you're interested in connecting with any of the wonderful people who have spoken today any further, I'd encourage you to reach out via the contact information that I've put up on the screen, and we'll be able to get you connected with them accordingly. The only other thing I wanted to share with you this month before we wrap up is that next month's panel discussion is going to be another really super cool, insightful one that I'm excited about, because we're going to be talking about the cost-based case for prevention. And so taking a look at sort of the financial side of things, because we've kind of touched on it more broadly in previous sessions and been like, it is better financially to kind of invest upstream and invest in preventing the issue. But it's something that understandably people are not necessarily too familiar with. And so I'm very excited to share that that's going to be something that you can expect from us in the coming days. Aside from that, I'd just like to wish you all a wonderful morning. A wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're calling in from. I wish you, wonderful travels if you're currently joining us at the International Conference on Youth Homelessness Prevention, and we'll be heading home soon. And whether I see you at next month's cost-based panel or a little further down the year, I just look forward to seeing you at another one of these conversations really, really soon. I'm going to hand back to Angela now to close us out with a poem, but thanks again so much, everyone. It's been truly inspiring.
I echo everything Promise said. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to be here with us today. And I'm going to close out with a poem. And this poem is titled A Home from a Shack. And this poem really captures what I was feeling listening to these stories of survival and struggle and poverty. But yet these individuals, like my parents and grandparents, they had so much love and so much joy. And I marveled at the storytelling that would go on At the same time, they were battling so many things, right? And so I wrote this poem to commemorate them. It's called A Home from a Shack. I don't know how they did it, but I'm so glad they did. Raised large families with 8 to 12 kids, fed everyone, put clothes on each one's back, taught them to love, provided a home from a shack, prayed for a change, saw no change in sight, but faithful on their knees, trusted God in the night, and they arose in the morning with God on their minds, leaving vengeance to him while their spirits stayed kind. And I don't know how they did it. I just don't know how. They absorbed all that pain while their heads were unbowed, and somehow they got through it. They got through it somehow, trusting God always, then and now. Their faith unwavering in his reign, their benevolence enchanting, and their pain, oh, their pain, was for a future they envisioned. None of it was in vain. The definition of courage, the epitome of brave. And I don't know how they did it, but I'm so glad they did. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Angela. Happy Black History Month. I can see the finger snaps. I'm snapping my fingers too. No idea if you can hear it. I'm gonna put it right next to the mic to make sure it makes YouTube. But yeah, thanks so much, everybody. Take good care. I'll see you all in the
Thank you so much. Take care.
Promise.
Bye.
Bye.